So welcome everybody. Hello. I assume we'll get more people as we go. I should start with a warning that two of my kids told me, how in the world are you going to teach a class on relationships? We watched you with relationships, and as I was just telling Sue, I spent 7 days in Madrid with my daughter just recently, and after like day 5, I was asking myself, how am I going to talk about relationships when we're ready to kill ourselves right now? Primarily because we're so much alike. At one point, we were doing a tour with the tour guide. It was just the two of us, and she told this joke, and I was just like, I almost told the same joke. That's terrible. We're the same person. So I'm not teaching this as an expert. As with all my classes, I'm teaching this with almost no fault of you guys. It's all about me. As they say at work, Dave, this isn't always about you. It's stuff that I'm interested in, and you guys just sort of get to join me for the ride. So I've moved from various theological things to doing my 15-part series on the historical Jesus, to archaeology, to food, to music, to whatever, and now that I'm an empty nester, I'm interested in relationships. A little late, but it's actually related to a book that I mentioned on the class called The Secular Age by a guy named Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher. He talks about in the church that we've had this thing called the anthropological term. And just so you know, this is a 3-part series, but it's a little bit weird because we didn't have Wi-Fi last week. It's going to be, I'm going to do this week, and this is going to be sort of more negative approach. I'm gonna be talking about what you shouldn't do with certain things. Lee is going to be talking next week. He's going to be much more constructive and fix everything that I said. And then after that, Matt will be talking several weeks later on October 25th, right? And Lee's going to talk about a lot of different relationships, and you're going to talk about friendship. And I'm going to talk a lot about relationships, marriage, and divorce, just to make sure I hit all of the hot spots. But Charles Taylor talks about the anthropological turn, and that is that the church for most of its time was very much vertically oriented, where our focus was on our relationship with God. But in the 16, 17, 1800s, we shifted, so we were more horizontal, what we were focused on. And to think about it, you can think about Jesus' summary of the 600 plus laws in the Old Testament. He was asked, what are the greatest commandments? And what's his answer? The first one is
to love the Lord your God with all your heart.
Right, which is a vertical thing. And then what's the second one?
Love your neighbors.
Which is more of a horizontal thing. So I don't think this is a bad thing. Some people say that the church has become man-centered as a result. That's not a terrible thing, because Jesus is actually, by Orthodox theology, a combination of 100% man, 100% God. And so there's been this shift. And I've talked about these things before in a piecemeal fashion, but I'm still sort of working through it. And here are 4 ideas that I have sort of tied to this anthropological term. And I don't mean to give you a bunch of heavy terms. And once I explain this to you, you'll understand a little bit more. And that is, first, that our faith today is based less on propositions and affirmations and more on experience. When you're in a discussion about faith, we tend to argue more, and we do argue. I think we should be homo arguabilists because we like to argue so much. But you'll hear it actually in the debate about same-sex marriage or gay rights or whatever. You'll hear it when the debate is conservatives tend to rely on propositions and say this is wrong because of whatever and cite some sort of authority. Those who make a shift, frequently you'll see senators and stuff. Governor Kasich stated his position and was all a reference to experience. My daughter's best friend is gay, and when I met them, that changed whatever. So it's a reference to the authority, and actually you see it in terms of what people read today. Memoirs, very, very popular because people are talking about their experience, and they use that experience as a platform for what they argue. And you look at the types of churches that are growing: Pentecostal churches, charismatic churches, those that place a heavier reliance on experience. When Christians are more interested in rites, as in individual rights, than rights, R-I-T-E-S, how the church operates. In particular, I was at a funeral yesterday for Justice Crooks, the Supreme Court Justice who my wife worked for the last 7 years. And it was, I was sitting next to someone who was Baptist, and we were talking because it's all run by guys. And then at the end, they had women come up and do communion. And it was just something that was, an interesting thing going on. And afterwards, a lot of us were talking about that. It just became very much apparent. Another, authority resides in the individual, not in the authorities. Just to say the church says you are supposed to do this is not a sufficient reason or explanation for whatever you're doing. You can't just say this is the way we've always done it. As you know, all of us would bristle at that sort of thing if we say that's the reason that we should do it, is just that's the way we've always done it. And then the one that I'm focused on today, which is the church's focus is becoming less theological, and I don't mean this in a bad way, and more relational. And the way to think about this is if you look at controversies in the past, in the year 320 AD 325, which is when the Council of Nicaea came together and did the Nicene Creed, the big debate was what? Does anyone know what the debate was? The debate was the relationship between Jesus and God. And was Jesus of one being with the Father, or were they slightly different, or what was the relationship or whatever? Today, that sounds like an incredibly arcane and irrelevant sort of discussion. I mean, rarely do we hear those sorts of things. Or in 1054, when the Western Church and the Eastern Church split, anybody know what the phrase is? The phrase is that led to the church. Today we have an Eastern Orthodox Church and a Roman Catholic Church because of one. And what is that?
The Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit proceeds from, does he proceed from the
Father and the Son?
Once again, I'm using gendered language, but does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father, or does does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son? Who here cares about that issue? Okay, I'll sound mad. I didn't think that hand was going to go up. I just knew that. Anybody else here? You have a strong position. And what is your position? You're and the Son, right?
Sometimes.
You need a class just for that. Or, actually to make it even closer to home, take it to 15, 17, 18, 19. What was Luther's project all about? We're talking about faith and works and all that sort of stuff.
Purgatory or penance, wasn't it?
Say that again?
Purgatory or penance?
Well, he was interested in that, and he was interested in the sale of the indulgences and all that. Again, today, none of that really resonates with me or with most people. This is a church that's very much focused on this vertical thing, where our relationship to God, and not just God, and how the Godhead relates to itself is very much the focus. Today, what are the issues that, and you guys are free to disagree with me. This is something I'm working out on my own and was thinking about a great deal over the summer. And if you do have, go ahead.
Luther's proposition that you're saved by faith alone, that's strong now.
I think it's strong now in different places, but I think it's I think it doesn't get the sort of I think it actually comes up a great deal in ecumenical discussions, because it's a sort of thing that Lutherans and Catholics and Episcopalians can now sort of get around, because they can't get around the issues that are actually what dominates our discussions today. And what are our controversies today? They're largely relational. For instance, the first one, how do we deal with people of other faiths? Do we think, right now, a great deal of our discussion is, how do we think about Muslims? And what do we think about Muslims? Do we think, how do we deal with ISIS? How do we think, there are several books coming out right now arguing that Islam is fundamentally a violent faith. Is that true? Is that not true? That's the sort of thing, you can go on talk radio and hear that discussion. You don't hear a discussion about faith versus works. That's not the sort of thing that gets people boiling. And obviously, same-sex marriage, that's something we've dealt with here. It's just something you deal with everywhere, whether it's, I have a family member who goes to a small evangelical school in rural Indiana, and it's something that they're dealing with there. Again, a relational thing. And as I told you yesterday, the rights or role of women and gays and lots of people within the church, those are the sorts of things that we're discussing right now. So the issues are relational, but I was thinking about this and turn it the other way. How does our faith inform our relations? And so as Lutherans, the Bible is often our ground or basis or authority, not the only authority, but one of the principal authorities for what we're doing. But and I'll tell you my thesis for today to sort of to give you the ending away. What do you call that when you give the ending away?
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. This is my spoiler alert, which is that reading the Bible in a very nonchalant, easy, and a way that many of us do can lead to, can be a harmful and dangerous thing for our relationships. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to take the relationships that I'm interested in, and actually I talked with the confirmation class about some of these same passages on Wednesday, and Matt was there for that. And it's interesting to see kids respond to some of these things. So what does the Bible say about how children are supposed to relate to their parents? Most of us know these things. What does it say? Sit down and shut up. That's the gospel according to Dad. Because I said so. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. So, honor your father and your mother. Or Ephesians picks up and does a variation on it. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Ephesians 6:1. And who can argue with those things? And another one from the parents' perspective toward kids, one that I heard frequently as a kid was, and train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. And no one can disagree with those things. But the thing is, in the Bible, for every passage like this that sounds okay, there are passages that are not so okay. That's the question mark on this one. And this is what is fun, these passages. So if you don't under Leviticus and Exodus, and Deuteronomy, if you don't obey your parents, does anyone know what the rule is for what you're supposed to do?
It's stoned.
So right, we go to Deuteronomy 21:18-21. If someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, then all the men of the town are to stone him to death. So we're okay with the first part, not so okay with the second part. What's really weird is the part I deleted right here because it gets too long, is the parents go nuts. They're supposed to go to the town elders and not just tell them that my kid won't listen, but they also have to tell them that the kid's a drunkard and a glutton and all that stuff. And there's no evidence of all that, but you know, parents are in charge in this world, so they can say whatever they want to about the kid.
You give them marijuana, it's stoned.
I don't think that's what it means. Even in Colorado. That's not what they mean. This one, which I heard a lot, and as you guys know, I grew up in a very hardcore fundamentalist household, and I was spanked and disciplined until I was 18 and went away to college. In fact, the day before I went to college, I was spanked. Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. Now, most of us have sort of gotten away from that or rejected that. In fact, I personally reject doing capital punishment with children, but still an issue. I wrote about Alderman Ashanti Hamilton, who beat one of his kids with a hanger, and it's an issue within, in particular in African American churches, about how you deal with a passage like this, and they point to this. This is in the Bible, therefore you should do it. Another one, and this one really kids, girls hate this one. Women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness, and holiness with propriety. So it's not just enough that you got to pass a human through your whatever, but you also have to do all of these other things as well. And that is according to 1 Timothy this is your role in life, is childbearing, and that's where your salvation comes by. And if you want to understand what that means by you will be saved, what that phrase means, it means will be saved. It's talking about your salvation. This is a whole passage on it's a passage written actually by a disciple of Paul. It's not written by Paul. We'll say it's by Paul, but it's written by a disciple of Paul, probably a generation after him, in which he says, well, you can help me, Matt. What does it say? You can't wear pearls if you're a woman. You should watch your adornment. Your hair should not be too short.
Yep.
And then you should pump out the kids. So very progressive ideas about life today. So what do you do with that? And then finally, this is one of my favorites, Psalm 137:9. Is happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. And I do seriously, and this takes a little bit of work, but I do seriously love this passage. It's Psalm 137:9. It's by Israelites who had their entire community destroyed during the Babylonian exile in 586. And the Babylonians have come in and wiped out the community, most of the community, killed a vast amount of genocide involved, and taken the elders and moved them out of the community. People are very angry about this. And these passages are people writing with a great deal of anger. They bring themselves to the passage, and they're saying, what happened to us, we want to happen to you. Basically what kids call, and we know as karma. You should get what you deserve. A theme that you'll see in Deuteronomy a great deal. Go ahead.
Not to get off track, but in practical reality, before and after these phrases were codified in the written Bible, what percentage of people actually went out and did this? We had a kid that they didn't like and had him stoned.
Right. For a long time, it was felt like that what was in the Bible reflected reality, but it's come to be understood that most of what's written in the and I don't like saying Old Testament because it makes it sound like old's no good, new's good. What's in the Hebrew Bible is written by an elite class of people, and much of it by a priestly class, describing what they think the society should be like. And like most priests, apparently they didn't care much for kids. I think that's so. Certain things like you might know about Jubilee years or whatever, where everybody's debt was forgiven and all the land was returned to the parents and stuff, didn't happen very much. But the verses are there. We consider the Bible authoritative. So what do you guys think? What do we do with these passages? Do we just pick the passages we like these, and just ignore the others and say that they're not there? Do we have some sort of system? What do we do for, and these aren't all Old Testament stuff. I can find tons of New Testament stuff. And it doesn't even have to be children and parents. Let's talk about, what does the Bible say about how we're supposed to regard our enemies? What does Jesus say? And we all know that, but what else is in the Bible? There's a lot of genocide. There's a great deal of ethnic cleansing. You can see Joshua, who's one of the people we're supposed to idealize, in Joshua 8 and 10, going through and even crucifying people, hanging people on trees and stuff like that, which we think of as a Roman thing. Or God telling Saul in 1 Samuel 15 that when he goes through a community, not supposed to just kill the soldiers, the parents, but kill all the children and all of the livestock, all of that sort of stuff. So you have those sorts of passages too. So you have this dual thing, just like with children. And then secondly, even with love your enemies, how do we apply that? Is that for us individually? Is that good foreign policy? Is that when people take airplanes and run them into into the Twin Towers? Are we supposed to say love our enemies? What is that for exactly? This isn't an easy thing where I was taught basically deal with these issues by find a verse and deal with it. Or marriage, and I'm going to talk about marriage in just a few seconds. as the focus, but you can find verses about in Genesis 2:24, a lovely and wonderful passage that you hear of a lot of weddings about. For this reason, a man is to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh, which is a great passage. But what else do you see in the Bible about marriage? You find weird stuff from Paul. First of all, the two main characters in the New Testament never get married, Jesus and Paul. You see Paul say it's better to be married than to burn. He means with passion. He means with passion. So basically, if you're going to go out and do something really bad, you should probably get married instead. But he says if you're a widow, it's probably best that you never get married. And so I read that stuff and I'm like, what's going on here? We have these passages with really great and wonderful stuff that we can embrace and help us with our relationships, but then we run into some of these really horrible things, or things that are discordant, that really don't match with what we're going on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about marriage now, and how we deal with these passages and how we think about these passages. I'm not going to solve all this stuff because I don't have a month to do it, but I'm going to give you some ideas on how we think about these passages that don't really, that strike us in a bizarre way, things that we don't really want to talk about. Matt actually has the unfortunate assignment of dealing with the passage on divorce in Mark, which is just to help you get ready for that. I'm going to deal with it at the very end of this class, and we'll see if he agrees with my take on it. But we'll deal first with marriage. And the thing is, it's really easy to open up the Bible and to see a passage and see it deals with a term that we're very familiar with, like marriage, and think that this applies to us. But in reality, the Bible has terms that we use, then they have a completely different worldview attached to that term. We have a different worldview, and I've talked frequently, like anytime you open up the Bible, it's a clash of civilizations. It's our worldview with their worldview, and bam. Sometimes they work okay, and sometimes there's a major collision, just like some of those passages I just mentioned to you. It's just like a major collision. How could the Bible actually say something like this? Well, part of it is jarring to us because we have all of these assumptions. And I'm going to talk right now about a particular story, and I actually need people to help me with this. To show you a particular story that works only if you understand the worldview, which is a dramatically different worldview from our own. So I need one person to be Abraham and one person to be Sarah. We're going to take Genesis 11 to Genesis 22. Anyone want to be a volunteer? You don't have to do anything. I'm just going to show you how the story plays out. Just one man, one woman. All you have to do is stand here. It's not going to be difficult. Raise your hand if you don't mind.
I can do that.
Okay, you can. So do you want to be Abraham? Or do you want to be Sarah? Father Abraham. So the story is in Genesis 11 that, and it's interesting when you read the story, it says they're cousins, but they've gotten married together, and a certain number of years. He's about 80, looks good. She's in her 70s, and it says nothing about him, but it says she is barren. Okay? Just the way, they don't say that they are infertile or whatever, but it says she's barren, so they have no kids. And then God comes to Abraham and says what to Abraham? You're going to be a leader of a great nation, and you're going to have this land that's a huge land. It's going to be your land. And you know, I love Abraham. He's one of my favorite characters in the Bible. That's why I'm picking this passage. First of all, it's very, in terms of the worldview, it's ancient, but the story itself is modern, because the story works just like any of our novels. A novel works because it has conflict. You have to have a problem, an unresolved problem, and then you spend the rest of the novel trying to resolve it. Well, God comes to him and tells him that. And the thing is, Noah would have just sat back and let whatever happen, because that's what he did. God comes to Noah and says, I'm going to destroy everything but a few animals in your family. And he's like, cool, where's the hammer? Abraham, when they said they're going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham says, what if there are 50 righteous people? What if there's 45? What about if there's 10? And then there's not. So they go ahead and destroy it. But he's bargaining with him. And in this case, Abraham says, okay, you've given me an assignment and I'm going to fix it. Okay? So how am I going to fix it first? Well, I'm going to have Lot be my heir, who's my cousin. His dad's died. So he's basically family anyway. So I'm going to take Lot. Lot's going to be my son, and we're going to go through there. So I need Lot. Do you mind being Lot? You're up there. You're Lot now. So there we go. Family situation solved. Everything is solved. We have a family. Great nation will come through Lot. Everything's fixed. Except for his shepherds and his shepherds hate each other. His shepherds hate each other. So after a couple of chapters, bam, they say, we're going to split up. You get to leave. You're no longer family. Bam, you're back down. So Abraham, still thinking, how do I fix this? I'm going to have a great nation. I'm getting older. I'm into my 90s. Still looking good. Who knew he worked out? So he says, okay, I've got a slave, Eleazar. I'm going to take Eleazar, and what am I going to do? Lee, you're Eleazar. Eleazar is going to be my heir, and he's going to have lots of children through Eleazar. And Eleazar will be my heir. He's my slave. I own the guy, as the Bible says. If you hurt a slave, no big deal. It's your property. You can do whatever you want with it. So he's property. He's now, and there we go, the happy family. But then God walks in and says, and says, Eleazar, back, you're out. Your great nation is actually going to come through your offspring, and you're not blood. So then you decide you're going to solve the problem. And how does she solve the problem?
Hagar.
Or if you're Jewish, it's Hagar, because all the accent's always on the last verse. So actually, do you mind? We need a female. You mind coming up?
Right now.
So we won't watch this, but the two of them get together, they have a kid. You always have to worry about who you pick for these things. People with a claw. So they have a kid. It's wonderful. The kid's name is Ishmael, and everything's solved, right? Everything's okay. But then, while this is going on, God comes back as a visitor with two buddies, and they meet with him, and they say, no, your heir will not be through your own seed alone. It's going to be through Sarah. So you're still there. And she's not very fond of her, and particularly not fond of Ishmael. Do you remember what happens? It's actually, the story's told twice, and they end up sending Hagar and Ishmael to woods, and it's actually a very lovely story about where she decides at one point, I can't watch Ishmael die, so she gets a certain distance away from him and expects him to die of starvation or whatever, and then God comes in and says, no, there will be a great nation found of you. And Muslims come to conclude that that's the Ishmael was whatever. But you're sent out, you go out, form your own people, and you leave now. So it's just the two of them. And when God says this to the two of them, what happens? What happens? Actually, there's two versions, which is great in the Old Testament, because the authors of the New Testament, when they have two conflicting stories, their propensity, ours is to merge them together and make sure there's no inconsistency. The authors of the Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible, they put them both in there and say, you figure it out. Okay? No, seriously, that's what they do. So there are two versions, and God tells Abraham, you're going to have a kid, and he looks at him, and now he's 99 years old, and Abraham laughs and says, you're kidding me. A couple chapters later, they retell the story, and she laughs. And guess what? He didn't get punished, but she gets punished. And then Isaac is born. and Isaac's name means
Laughter.
laughter. So you have all of these things. So everything, finally you have the story resolved, right? Everything's neat and clean and finished. We've spent all these chapters. The story makes sense if you understand all of how the family works exactly, how he was thinking, and so forth. But actually the story's not resolved. You're on like page 300 of a 350-page novel. What happens now?
He's told to kill. to
Then
slaughter
God
and
says,
sacrifice.
you have one heir, and now you have to go sacrifice him, which is dealing with a completely other issue, but that's like a good novel again. You think the story's resolved, and then it's not resolved. There's another chapter, and you go through, and then that's finally resolved. The only funny thing is, when he decides not to, when he stopped from doing it, and Isaac is not sacrificed, which is in Genesis 22. If you keep on reading, and I told you it's Genesis 11 and 22, and if you're looking for something like, where should I start in reading a Bible? First of all, it creeps out people at work to take a Bible. They think you're crazy. But if you are looking for a decent story, this Genesis 11, the end of 11 to 22 is a great story to read as a novel, since you know what's going on with his stuff. But then in Genesis 25, you find out Abraham actually had a second wife and has like 12 kids by that second wife. Did you know that? What are you doing? so we're done with them. Thank you very much. Very good. But the story works. The story works because there are all these assumptions that you're supposed to understand with it, with this thing. One, it's okay for the family to be patriarchal. He decides what's going to happen. Hagar decides very late what's going to happen. Cousin marriage, not a problem. Didn't even raise it as an issue. It's just like, well, they're cousins. And then there's actually these weird situations where they go to Egypt and he has to act like she's his sister or relative, and he says, really, she is my relative. And you're supposed to be, oh yeah, that's right, that makes sense. Endogamous, you can marry within your clan or group. That's not a problem. You're not supposed to marry outside your clan or group. You're supposed to marry within the clan or group. You're supposed to just marry those near you. Polygynous, which is not polygamy. Polygamy is men and women can marry many people. In his case, a guy can marry as many women as he wants. That's the assumption. And it's funny, I was listening to Sheriff Clark in the debate about same-sex marriage, and he says, marriage has not changed in 3,000 years. This was like 3,000 years ago. This is not the same sort of marriage that we're used to. The family, extended and communal. He can take his cousin, his nephew, Lot, bring him in. That's not a problem. That's part of his family. He can take his slaves and just say, you're mine, you're having kids. That's the way it works. Very hierarchical. And you know, this is one thing that we don't understand, but every writer of the Bible has this view of relationships that starts with the father at the top, then the sons, then the wife, then the daughter, and then the slaves. We've taken that and shifted it like this. It's not been a clean, swift shift like this, because you can still see that this view of the father as the idealized figure, authority figure, it's still the source of humor to take that person and turn them into a buffoon. The whole Simpsons thing is based on this shift that we're doing where we're sort of not quite entirely comfortable with the guy being always right about everything, so it's hilarious when that guy screws up. That's the basis for the argument. That's still going on. 2, high value on tradition and community. Mates are limited and they're arranged for expediency. That's you don't want to leave marriage to the kids because they have no idea what they're doing. And then divorce is extremely rare. By contrast, this is what our view is. And I told you, same term but 2 different things. Did you want to say something?
Just one other thing to add, and death is extremely common.
Sure.
So losing a spouse, losing a child, happen very often. So having to have this little bit of a mix and match approach
So not
to
just
family was
not just
practical.
that, but also replaceable.
Replaceable.
You just you keep it going. Today, a much more egalitarian system, monogamous. It's okay for us to marry outside our groups. I mean, and again, as you see this shift occur, you can look to literature. Fiddler on the Roof is all about this change from marrying within your group to marrying outside of your group. You see, and there's a lot of people, a lot of literature based on this idea of the shift from the traditional to the more modern ideas. 2, cousin marriage is not acceptable, except in I grew up in West Virginia. The nuclear unit's self-contained, it's non-hierarchical, and I say non-hierarchical, as I said, it's still shifting, we're still dealing with those sorts of things. And the whole idea of the rights of children is another thing that we're still sort of dealing with. Actually, that I'm still dealing with. And then low value on tradition and community, mates less limited, and you're self-selected based on romantic love, and divorce is more common. And those last two notions I'm going to talk about right now, and that's about how marriage has changed in terms of how we select one another, and how this has dramatically changed in just the last 300 years, how it continues to change over the last 30 years. Stephanie Kuntz, is anyone familiar with her at all? Okay, I told you, part of my role here is to read books so you don't have to. She wrote a book called Marriage: A History, which in the Supreme Court decisions on same-sex marriage, you'll see both sides referring to this book and arguing about this book. I'm going to give you just a few-minute video from her discussing how marriage has changed, the nature of marriage has changed in recent years. This should work, right?
Should work.
Waiting. Connecting.
Has to be mated with the servant.
Did you already open the tab to the left again?
Occasionally.
There you go.
Dan, you're saying it's a relationship under strain?
I need volume.
TV volume.
What she's saying is romantic love has been known throughout the centuries, but it's not been viewed as as something that's valued or associated with marriage.
Will it work on the TV, Brian? Will it work on the side of the TV?
Turn the TV speakers on.
Keep going, it's going up.
Turn the TV speakers on.
Speakers on.
It's just playing out the laptop right now.
I can't hear you.
I said it's just playing out the laptop right now.
Right.
So turn the TV speakers on.
They are on, but
Okay.
it's not transferring the sound through.
Go into advanced audio.
You can't hear it, can you?
No.
No.
It's not singing.
But their idea of love was that it is something that could possibly exist in marriage. They conventions
That's just a different.
Yeah.
every culture in the world,
Knows that there's such a thing. But in most cultures, and for most of history, this is not an emotion that is celebrated, especially in conjunction with marriage. In traditional India, falling in love was considered a dangerous, antisocial act, a challenge to the family. In ancient China, the traditional word for love in China meant an illicit, socially disapproved relationship. It wasn't until the 1920s that a group of intellectuals decided that they needed to invent a new word to describe the new kind of love that was being acceptable between husband and wife. In the European tradition, most of our conventions of romantic love are inherited from the originators of courtly love in southern France. But their idea of love was that it is something that could not possibly exist within marriage. The main chronicler of the conventions of courtly love, Andreas Capellanus, once wrote that marriage is no excuse for not loving. And by that he meant not loving someone outside of marriage. In the 17th century, Christian moralists continually scolded wives who used endearing nicknames for their husbands, because that kind of expression of love was a contradiction to the awe and fear that marriage was supposed to be about in terms of the relationship.
Because it's about obedience,
and
not
as
about
late
love.
as the 18th century, the word love was used much more often for neighbors, kin, and God than it was for spouses. It wasn't until the late 18th century that what we now think of as the essence of love and marriage going together like a horse and carriage, it became respectable to encourage people to make their choices. For the reason that people were so historically suspicious about love is that marriage for thousands of years had very little to do with the individual relationship between a man and a woman. I'm old enough to remember I grew up in the 60s when anthropologists were telling us that marriage was invented to protect women and children. And then a lot of feminist anthropologists came along in the 70s and said, no, marriage was invented to oppress women and children. And the more I study marriage, the more I'm convinced that the invention of marriage had nothing at all to do with the relationship between the man and the woman. Marriage was invented to get in-laws. It was a way of turning strangers into relatives, of making peace. That's why the word for wife in many languages means peace weaver. As societies became more stratified, marriage became a way of getting connected in-laws. And as such, it became a center of maneuvering and control and coercion and betrayal for thousands and thousands of years. The upper class used marriage to seal military alliances, to sign peace treaties, to consolidate wealth, to increase their claim to social power. My son is, we're descended from Charlemagne, and so I need to marry someone also descended from Charlemagne in order to strengthen my claim to the throne. For the middle classes, it was a business alliance, a way of getting connected in-laws, and even in the lower classes, it was a way of expanding your family labor force, getting new connections. So love, for thousands of years, marriage was just much too important to leave it up to individual choice, and especially an individual choice based on something so irrational as the feeling of love. As I said, it wasn't until the late 18th century that this new radical idea came along. Part of it was the Enlightenment, the idea that the older generation shouldn't dictate to the younger, and the state shouldn't dictate to the younger generation. And part of it were the individualistic ideas of the Revolutionary era in France and America, the Declaration of Independence, with its claim that people are entitled to the pursuit of happiness, and that goes for personal relationships as well. And they ought to pursue happiness in marriage and on the basis of love. And what's fascinating is that immediately social conservatives of the day, defenders of what was then the traditional marriage, political and economic convenience, were absolutely horrified. They said, oh my gosh, if you make marriage about love, how are we going to get the right people to marry? If my son could say, I don't love her, stupid reason like that. How are we going to prevent the wrong people from marrying? Today, the debate is, gays and lesbians are saying, well, if marriage is about love and sexual satisfaction and it no longer has to be about gender roles, why can't we have access to marriage? In the 18th century, they were afraid that poor people would want access to marriage. The other thing they were worried about is, if you say marriage is about love and mutual respect, what's going to prevent people from demanding a divorce if the marriage does not turn out to be about that?
The interesting thing is, as people have put more and more, have increased the stakes for what marriage is supposed to do, that it's supposed to, it moved first from marriage was something about community, then it became a sacrament, then it became a contract, and today it's about self-fulfillment, very much about what's called individual expressionism, that we find the relationship to be fulfilling, and we're supposed to love one another, and it's supposed to be mutually beneficial. But as the stakes rise, marriage becomes much more fragile because it doesn't accomplish all those things. In the 1600s, it was about protection and safety, and you did your own thing, and it was not very much about love at all. But as love has gotten involved, it's increased the stakes. And so, you know, when we have marriage and we just talk about marriage in this particular way today, as she said, divorce tends to coincide because it's much more fragile. If you can't accomplish what you want, if it isn't fulfilling, if you aren't getting satisfaction out of it, should you get out? Well, and in the biblical times, there's no notion of a very patriarchal system of a husband beating a wife or of rape within marriage. You know, it's funny because with Donald Trump, his former wife accused him of rape, and it was 1987, and it was interesting because the law in New York was only a year or two old. Just to think that rape within marriage is relatively, I mean, all of us have lived at a time when that wasn't a crime, is pretty amazing. So I'm just going to touch on, so my main point is, as I said, when we go to the Bible and we use the Bible to help us understand how we should have our relationships, first of all, we need to realize it's coming from a completely different worldview than what we have. And maybe there are some things we can take from it, but it's an incredibly dangerous thing just to pluck it out and say, this applies to us today. And the same thing is true of divorce. And I know it's a tricky subject to try to deal with in 10 minutes, but Jesus talks about divorce, but it's not really clear what he's saying. This is the passage I think you're dealing with, which is anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. So this makes us like, because my parents are divorced. I have a number of friends who divorced. This is really, you know, a sort of, I mean, it sort of touches me. It's an issue that's prevalent today. You know, Christianity Today, the evangelical magazine, in the 1960s, divorce was the big issue in the magazine. But in the 70s, the issue almost disappeared completely because too many of the readers were actually getting divorced. The one thing I want you to notice about this, though, is the second half of this sentence. First part, anyone divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. Second half, and if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. Now, you guys might not agree with me on this, but I don't think Jesus said the second half of that sentence. The reason I don't think Jesus said that second half of the sentence is because Jesus was a Jew talking to a Jewish audience, and Jewish women had no right to divorce. So the early church, in taking this message, and the author of Mark is talking to a Gentile audience at that time, expands it and applies it to women too, okay? This is a hot passage even in the first century, and people are dealing with this. You'll also find that there's, in the various Bibles that we have, in the various transcripts of the Bible, there's 6 variations of this passage changing all these things. The people actually transcribing the Bible would get to this passage and say, Jesus couldn't have meant that, and they would alter the thing and add various things. The author of Matthew tells a different story. He says, I tell you, and in Mark, there are no grounds for divorce, okay? In Matthew, it says, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery. Okay, so what's the author of Matthew done? He's thrown in an exception saying you can get divorced because of sexual immorality. I think it actually, the translation for the term porneia is adultery. So he's thrown in an exception that I don't think was probably there to begin with. Maybe it was, maybe he's right. And the thing is, every copy we have of Matthew before the year 1000 has this exception in it. No copy of any document we have of Mark before the year 1000 has that exception in it. So there's 2 completely different traditions. And then secondly, Matthew has no assumption that a woman can get divorced. Okay? Third one, this is Paul writing before either of these 2 other books have been written. This is written around the year 50, probably 20 years before the other 2. A wife must not separate from her husband. He's again speaking to a Gentile audience where they can do this. But if she does, What's that all about? So you're not supposed to, but what if you do? Okay, it happens. She must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. Okay, that's in line with Jewish. It's actually not in line with Jewish tradition. Jewish tradition said a man can basically get divorced for anything he wants. It's a thing called a get, a J-E-T, G-E-T. You can just, if you get a get, you can get rid of the woman. Okay, and that's still true today within Orthodox Judaism. You can say, and the rabbis have interpreted the law to say, if she burns your dinner, that's enough, that's sufficient reason for her to get a get. Or if you see another woman who's more attractive and you ask your wife to try to, fix herself up and she's still not attractive enough, that's still good enough reason to get a get. But then he adds, but if the unbelieving spouse, if it's a believing unbelieving spouse, leaves, let it be so. So he's created another exception. And again, on the second one with Matthew, we have 5 variations. Again, the guys writing this thing just can't believe what is being said, and they're struggling with the passage, just like we struggle with the passage today. This is not new that the issue of divorce is a hot topic. Okay? The guys, single guys, in the monasteries writing out these things, struggled with the passage. And the authors of these things struggled with this passage. And so one theologian who spent a lot of time trying to get to the bottom of all of this reaches the position, David Parker, who's somebody I really like a great deal, says the recovery of a single original saying of Jesus on the issue of divorce is impossible. What we have is a collection of interpretive rewritings of a tradition. So there is some tradition. Jesus was clearly interested in the issue of divorce, but we can't really tell what's there because everybody's upset about it, worried about it, trying to change it, trying to say, this is right, that's right. We have so many variations that we're not really sure what was originally there. And this makes me a little bit uncomfortable, but at the same time, I like it because I like the fact that our struggles with divorce, this isn't a new thing. This is actually, even though we come from 2 different worldviews, the struggle is very similar then as it is now. So what do we do with these things? Fortunately, Lee will be talking next week and cleaning up the mess I've left for all of you. And then Matt will clean up the rest of the mess.
Come to sermon next week, we'll try to figure it out.
But I'm going to take you back to something that I taught a year ago on the Bible, the broken Bible. How do you deal with the underbelly of the Bible? And these are my principles for reading the Bible. And the first one is read the Bible, it'll surprise you. There's stuff, all sorts of crazy stuff in there. And it was funny when Rebecca Clayfish said that the recall started, that she sent a verse to Governor Walker sent a verse back to them. And so for the next day, various reporters were sending me verses, and I was sending out verses. And I had the greatest verses to send to everybody. They're like, that's not in the Bible. Yes, it is. Don't major on minor issues. There are a number of minor issues, and it's easy to get distracted by those things. Focus on the big things. What Jesus says the law is. This is the law. He says those 2 things, but he also says the golden rule. This summarizes everything in the law. 3, read the Bible through the lens of Jesus. When you read a passage that's disturbing or whatever, how does it fit with what Jesus said and what Jesus did? Consider the divine word as told by actual flawed individuals. These are people who lived with a particular worldview and brought that worldview and included it in the text. And as a result, we end up with some of these complicated and difficult issues. The hard thing is figuring out what is divine and what is flawed. But we're flawed too, and that's part of what we do. 5, don't park your brain when you crack open the Bible. Bring modern interpretive techniques and bring your own personality to the thing. Like I told you, not a fan of Noah. That's me. When you read it, you might like Noah. I would disagree with you and think you're crazy, but Abraham I love. And so that's what I bring to the text when I read it. And then finally, treat the Bible like a conversation, not like a rule book or a constitution. That when you see these things, you see that the actual authors of the Bible are arguing with each other. Jesus is arguing with the text in the Old Testament. He's arguing with the law. He's saying, this is what, you've heard this, but what about this? So it's a conversation, and Matt's sermon on divorce will be part of a conversation we have. Lee's conversation next week about all kinds of relationships, part of a conversation. You can disagree with it, just like you can disagree with almost everything I've said today. So I ran over, sorry about that. But thanks for listening. If anybody has a question, I can probably take one and then we can go. Okay, no questions. I will hang around and talk if you want to talk. Thanks for listening.
That woman that you
Yeah.